Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thanks so much for listening. The sponsor for this episode is Centralis Wine. Centralis is an ecological winery that I started to protect or benefit the environment and my community with every business and winemaking decision. I envision a wine world in which humans are the students and servants of the non-human world, regenerating and protecting the vitality of ecosystems and promoting the diversity of life through wines that uniquely and deliciously reflect local abundance. Centralis wines feature foraged prickly pears, urban perennial polyculture wine garden produced grapes and other fruit, gleanings from urban fruit trees, dry farmed century-old vines, and organic and biodynamic viticulture. If this sounds interesting to you, join our email list or wine club at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. For this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with two of my favorite authors on soil and our utter dependence on it, Anne Biklé and David R. Montgomery. Anne is a science writer and public speaker focusing on the connections between people, plants, food, health, and the environment. She has been known to coax garden plants into rambunctious growth and nurse them back from the edge of death with her regenerative gardening practices. Her work has appeared in digital and print magazines, newspapers, and radio. Her gardening practices have been featured in independent and documentary films. David is a MacArthur Fellow and professor of geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. His work has been featured in documentary films, network and cable news, TV and radio, including Nova, PBS NewsHour, Fox, and Friends, and All Things Considered. Anne and David together, because they live together and are married, have written a few books, and their work includes What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health, as well as a trilogy of books on soil health, microbiomes, and farming, including Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. I highly recommend checking out all of these books, especially if you are in any way involved with agriculture or soil or the things that come from it. These books are not only about soil, but about agriculture, our food system, human health, and survival, and the climate. And perhaps shockingly, they provide ample evidence for a way forward that provides solutions to the problems we face in all of these areas. Dare I say that they provide hope? And even more importantly, he says sarcastically, they provide ample evidence for how to farm grapes in a better way to make more delicious wine. Enjoy. And David, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really excited to talk to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Adam.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm a big fan of, your work. I've read a couple of your books, as I mentioned, and I think I'm really excited to talk to you because, from what I can tell from your latest books, your studies that you've done, shown again and again that we already know the solutions to many of our problems, and the solutions are often win-win for everyone and everything involved, unless you're selling plows or producing agrochemicals. So there's a lot of cause for hope and optimism. However, I'm guessing that the one really big hurdle that we need to clear is how to affect policy change to implement these solutions at a regional and national level, given our political situation. So that's a really big question that I want to get to, but I want to start with your story first. I just sort of wanted to tease that as a question I'd love to get to, because I think it's vitally important to everything that you guys are doing. What I really relate to about your story is how sort of falling down this rabbit hole began because you just decided to grow some stuff in your sort of semi-urban backyard. Is that right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that it did start with this, kind of my basic desire, which finally was going to be possible to do in Seattle when we bought a house some years ago, and that was to make a garden. And I had messed around with gardening and plants, but never at the scale, of a whole garden. And so what's kind of funny, Adam, is that so my background is in biology and natural history and environmental sciences, and so I was really enamored with the plants. So the botanist was like, "Oh, the plants! Look at all the different plants we're going to have," and Here's how they're going to look, and so on and so forth. And so we pretty much scraped everything off of our lot except for the house. And there we were, down to our dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And what is kind of embarrassing now that, I look back on it, is that neither the biologist nor the geologist, David, we didn't really take a very close look at our dirt at that time until it came the day to get the plants in the ground. And then I went, holy crap, we've really got some bad dirt here. I mean, that's kind of the long story short. And
Right.
so like I said, I'd done enough gardening, enough growing of plants, and enough, rescuing of plants, that I thought, okay, well, kind of blown the budget on the plants here. There's not a lot of money left to do anything with the soil, but organic matter, that is what this soil needs. That is what my gut told me. So I went about collecting all kinds of organic matter, mostly as close to home as possible, so that I could get it, and bring it into the garden. And so what kind of things were those? It was, making friends with the arborists that were in the neighborhood who were
Mm.
doing tree pruning and stuff. Wood chips are then and now remain one of my absolute favorite forms of organic matter. And then,
Mm.
Seattle is, overflowing with coffee. So that means coffee grounds. So that was another
Mm.
big thing that I relied on. And then we had our own, contributions of just food waste in a worm bin. And then we had a neighbor who has these beautiful oak trees. And so in the fall, all he did was complain about his leaves. And all I did was say, great, keep complaining. I'll be down there to get some. And so I brought oak leaves home, and I I really was that very first summer, water was a big problem. Watering and keeping it in the soil was a big problem. And I thought, okay, just
Mm.
throw these mulches together. Throw some of the wood chips, mix it up with the coffee grounds. Okay, this is too wet. Go get some dry leaves. Okay, now this is just the kind of texture and moisture level that I want. Go throw that on the bed. You can come back later and dig it in. So I essentially was doing sheet mulching with these different
Mm.
combinations of organic matter. And it helped a lot. It helped keep moisture in the soil, and that helped the plants survive. And the fact is, I never did go back to dig it in because, is anybody who is a farmer or gardener knows there's never enough, hours of daylight to do all the things you'd like to do. So you sort of deal with the emergencies, deal with the whims of your desires on a given day to go, either really get into something, or, be more contemplative and wander around and go, oh, look at all the stuff I have to do. I don't feel like doing it today, maybe tomorrow. So, those are the kinds of things. So in pretty short order, several years later, this is something else that was happening. I was moving plants around, because that's the other thing that happens in a garden is you don't like where things end up, or you realize, wow, that was a really stupid move to put this plant next to that plant. So you move them. And in order to move the plants, you got to push the mulch aside. And when I began to do that, I called Dave over. I'm like, hey, check this out. Look at that tiny little dark layer. That was never there before. This is neat.
Mm.
This organic matter is, I don't think I am going to dig it in because it's decomposing right where I want it. So this is perfect. I'm saving labor, I'm saving my time, and plants are getting what they want. And it got to the point where, there had been sort of, net imports of organic matter into the garden. And I'd say within about maybe 5, 7 years, it was becoming a situation where, great, wow, the garden is generating all of the organic matter I need to continue making the sheet mulches. And so there was no, I still, if I see a good pile of wood chips, I can't resist. So, I will still bring those in. But anyway, that's kind of where this all started. And at the time, Dave was writing the first book that we kind of call the beginning of the Dirt trilogy, which was about sort of the demise of soil,
Mm.
in long
That's
the long walk
that's
of
dirt.
agriculture. Yeah, right.
Dirt growing, or the erosion of civilization, right? Is
Yeah.
that the subtitle?
You got it. That was it. That
Okay.
was a book that I started working on. Really sort of as a labor of love. I'm a geologist. I've worked on erosional processes and how they shaped landscapes for most of my professional career. And I wanted to write a book that looked back at the history of how people had influenced soil erosion. And what I ended up writing, the deeper I got into it and the more that I learned about it, is I was writing a history of farming and about how the way people treated the land affected the way the land treated their descendants. So there's
Mm.
story after story from societies around the world of places that degraded their land to the lasting detriment of the people who continued to live on the land, their descendants. And as I was literally trying to finish that book up, struggling with how to write, a not too pessimistic last chapter that captured this, the astounding history of land degradation around the world through the ages. Here Anne was restoring fertility to our yard, just right outside the back door at a pace that a geologist considered, it's screamingly fast. To start rebuilding soil in, less than a decade is a lot different than the centuries to millennia that are generally taught that it takes to build, an inch of fertile soil. And that triggered all kinds of questions about, well, how is this working? How can this happen so fast? What's actually behind it? And that's what spurred Anne and I to write The Hidden Half of Nature together, looking at how she restored life to our land, life to our yard, and what the role of microbes, the bacterial and fungal communities in the soil, were playing in taking all that organic matter that she was layering around the yard and recycling it in effect back into the materials for life to take up to really build new life and to build the life in the soil. And um, we sort of went from there.
And then the next book was Growing a Revolution. Is that right? Is that the third of the trilogy, the soil trilogy, or
You got it.
is that
That's
Yeah.
right?
that's the third
Okay.
of the Dirt trilogy, and the Growing a Revolution grew out of the question that remained after we looked into the role of soil ecology in building and supporting soil health, and the parallels between what goes on around the roots of a plant and what goes on in the human gut in terms of partnerships with microbial life. I mean, we've all heard about the microbiome at this point, that are onboard. Microbes in our gut that help sort of modulate and regulate our health. But there's these amazing parallels between what goes around the roots of a plant and what goes on in our gut, with the obvious difference that what's inside and what's outside is reversed for those two systems. But
Mm.
Growing a Revolution grew out of the question that was sort of lingering after we wrote The Hidden Half of Nature, which was, okay, we could, if you can restore soil that fast in an urban lot with access to lots of coffee shops and arborists and neighbors with oak leaves, that's one thing. But what about doing it on full scale operational farms around the world? And so I took some time away from the university to go and visit farmers around the world who had done to their farms what Anne had done to our yard. So we visited regenerative farmers across the Midwest, in equatorial Africa, Central America, up in Canada, and looked at some of the parallels between what they were doing and what Anne had done to our yard to try and draw broader lessons for how we could restore fertility to the world's farmland soils, and do it in what turned out to be remarkably short order. I didn't set out to write an optimistic book, but it turned into one because of where I think the direction that it supports us thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like all of these books provide sort of study after study, case after case. It's like a compilation of showing again and again from literally every corner of the globe that like a regenerative form of agriculture is really the most productive, healthy, economic, and sustainable way to farm pretty much anything. And you've compiled like a mountain of evidence of that. And I mean, that's what's exciting and I think optimistic about it. It's also, it's yeah, like I said, it's sort of like we know there's just too much evidence, it seems, at this point to suggest that conventional farming is anything other than. I think I heard you actually refer to it, and I'm paraphrasing, but as sort of the farming of the last 20 years is something, or the last 100 years is, and the Green Revolution is something we should look at as a failed experiment, essentially. Um, Go ahead if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it necessarily a failed
Okay.
experiment because it did succeed at one thing, and that was raising crop yields, which was viewed
Okay.
as the singular goal. But if we look at it in terms of was it a wise experiment in terms of how it was played out and run, having that singular goal of only prioritizing yields turns out to, I think, have been a mistake. And what Ann and I argue in the new book, What's Your Food Aid, is that in
Right.
trying to prioritize feeding the world, we lost sight of nourishing the world and taking care of the land, which helps us to nourish the world. So I would basically characterize the last 100 years of agriculture as it's a failed experiment in terms of rebuilding soil health, because it did the opposite. Conventional farming has continued to accelerate the degradation of land, and but it's time, I would think, to essentially rethink what we think of as the primary goals of large scale, nation scale agriculture, and broaden it from simply trying to provision calories to a populace to try and provision nourishing food that can best support human health. And therein, there's a lot of missed opportunities in the last 100 years, and
Mm.
that often tends to be the problem with singular objectives. If you're dealing with a complex system like agriculture that involves ecology, chemistry, physics, weather, economics, um, optimizing for a single thing can often blind you to the inadvertent side effects of things like declining nutrient density in crops and other things that have affected human health at a fairly broad scale.
Yeah, I,
Yeah.
I think part of I mean, Dave put his finger on it when he mentioned sort of a single objective. I think every time, um, people have tried to solve a problem, we look at it sort of unidimensionally, which is to say, okay, here's this one thing we'd really like to accomplish. So, let's take, something that's been on our minds, a lot in the last several years is, human pathogens. And if you consider infectious diseases that come out of pathogenic bacteria and viruses, um, we obviously don't want those things in our bodies because they're it's bad news. So then we thought, and this was going back to sort of the dawn of antibiotics, and it seemed at that time that wow, we can use this thing called penicillin, which is interestingly enough a fungal product, and
Right.
we can there's other antibiotics that are made in the soil by soil bacteria, and we can learn what these are. We can synthesize them in a lab, and then lo and behold, they become these really powerful drugs, and we've knocked out one infectious disease after another. And then, decades later, with all this microbiome science, we're coming to realize just how powerful these antibiotics are and how they kind of scuttle and perturb um, all of the either neutral or beneficial microbes that comprise the human microbiome, and for that matter the soil microbiome. So somehow, Adam, we've got to get to this place in medicine and agriculture where we can embrace multiple objectives and goals and be able to better ascertain what are the trade-offs. If we do this, then what? If we do
Mm.
that, then what? And to sort of see things in their totality. And we have not done a great job with that at agriculture or medicine. And so uh, that's why I think sort of taking a regenerative approach to things. I really like that word because it gets it gets at um, that it's possible as a consequence of agriculture specifically to leave soil better off and not worse off. And I would hope that in the medical world somehow we'll figure out a way to use antibiotics, which are really important, in ways that don't harm the human microbiome. So that's kind of, I think, the new name of the game. And I look at a lot of things that are happening in the climate realm, and I wonder, So all of these ways of trying to clean up the atmosphere and suck the carbon out and so on, which which methods are going to leave um, the planet better off and people better off, and which methods maybe are not headed in that direction, although they may accomplish the singular goal of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that I
So
think is our that is humanity's major challenge for this century at least.
that's a yeah, that's a really great question. I think about that as well. Just yeah, how much of the actions that we're taking are motivated by sort of short term thinking and yet we'll be doing long term damage even though we've accomplished this one thing with regard to carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
Um, that's great. I mean, can you talk about? I mean, there's so many exciting studies. It's hard to narrow them down that you guys talk about. And I know, in your most recent book, what your food ate, you guys really are now verging on, like, the soil has led you into become almost nutritionists in a way.
Yeah.
um, and I do love that you were very careful in that book to you'd be talking about a certain kind of fat, and you'd say, just because we're saying like omega-6 does this doesn't mean that it's bad. You have to think about, you can't think good bad in terms of these things. You have to think, like you said, more holistically, more like a symbiosis of multiple different things and balance. And I really appreciated that holistic form of thinking, and you guys just stated it really well as well. um, it seems like also the more we learn, I mean, you mentioned, penicillin and being a fungus, like it seems like the more, I just heard a statistic that we've only identified and studied something like 6% of the fungi on the planet.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that there's this massive amount of stuff that we still have to learn, and so there is that sense of like, well, we can have a little humility, like who knows what we're going to discover. But I wonder if you could talk about, some of the things that we are learning and what's kind of exciting you guys now
Yeah. I
in that
think,
soil, whether
yeah.
it's soil microbiology, soil health, in that
Yeah.
realm,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
think
its
one of
relation to us and everything.
Yeah, David and I, we were just talking this morning. We were working on something, and it struck me that so much of the time in agriculture, especially when we're in the context of crops, we talk about um, plants are sucking up nutrients from the soil, and we most people think, oh yeah, nutrients, yeah, stuff like magnesium and zinc and iron and so on. And what we don't talk about enough, I think, is there are those straight ahead nutrients that are well recognized, both what they are and how critical they are, right? Like, so NPK, nitrogen, um, potassium, and phosphorus. Those are the three big things that if you want a plant to grow, it's got to have those. And common sources for those are the soil, or in the case of nitrogen, bacteria that can pull it out of the atmosphere and make it available to plants. That is like rock solid stuff. But what's been coming to light is also that we, and I guess this is maybe a little bit what you mean when you say we sort of became, these, bench nutritionists in order to be able to write what your food ate. Because it turns out, I think, and we try to make the case in the book, the way we think about and define, quote, nutrients is really pretty limited and pretty narrow in light of what we're learning about soil microbes and all of the things that they do. And so in many instances, plants are not just, looking to suck out, nutrients in the soil that have come out of, from the decay of rocks or the decay of some kind of organic matter. Because bacteria, and I, who knows, probably fungi as well. But since we only know, 6% or maybe even less the fungi in the soil, how do we really know, what are they doing and how are they functioning? But what we do know is that all these microorganisms, um, they're living, and so they have a metabolism, and they have, a genome, and they are able to make things and release things from their tiny, one-celled bodies. And so these microbial metabolites, plants are also taking up the products of microbial metabolism. And this is huge in my mind because it's sort of the dark matter of nutrition, if you will. And so
Mm.
this whole unknown, or recently discovered, we're learning a lot about it, this whole new universe of how plants communicate with the soil microbiome to take in not just nutrients, but it's molecules and compounds. It's all of the chemistry that's out there that plants need. And so they've co-evolved with the soil microbiome in the same way that they've co-evolved with pollinators. And we don't think about that enough when we talk about things like crop nutrition, or the way that crops get nutrients, that they need. And we always phrase it in terms of growth. Plants need these things to grow. We rarely phrase it in terms of, oh, that's right, the plant body, that green body is sitting out there in the environment, and it's dealing with challenges all the time, pathogens, these days, heat, drought, freezes, stuff like that. And
Mm.
so part of the relationship between plants and the soil microbiome is about these microbial metabolites that are also something, that the plant, quote, sucks into its body. And and these things, I think, are proving, you want to talk about agrochemicals, we should talk about the chemical factory that is a plant and the chemical factory that is the soil microbiome. And if I worked at an agrochemical company, I'd really want to know a lot more about those things, because we have sort of nature's alchemists and nature's, pharmacists and chemists sitting around us, sitting, on farms and in gardens. We just don't know enough about them.
Mm. That's fantastic. Yeah. I know you talked in What Your Food Ate about the overlooked importance, vital importance really to our health too, of their ability to uptake and communicate with these, I guess, phytochemicals, or sort of tertiary things that we don't think about as the big ones, as the big factors for health and growth. Uh, from what I understand, that actually can apply pretty directly to wine and wine quality and wine flavor as well. Have you guys looked into that at all? Do you have anything to say on that
Well,
spectrum?
we've looked into it a little bit. We didn't find as much research on that as you might like, but it's a big area.
Darn it.
Yeah, but it's a big area where the connections do seem like they should translate right over. um,
Right, right.
because there's what we were able to find was studies that looked at how farming practices, particularly tillage and synthetic fertilizer use and agrochemical use, influenced the ability of crops to take up mineral micronutrients, but and also to produce those phytochemicals, these plant-made compounds that are made in response to stimuli from soil life, or to take up the microbial metabolites that Anne was talking about. Um,
Right.
and also then, if you get into sort of animal agriculture, looking at the sort of the fat composition of meat and dairy, those are all things where there's pretty solid evidence that farming practices actually affects them. And what's known enough now about the mechanisms behind that, to really sort of draw the connections and to think about extrapolating to crops or areas that weren't directly involved in those studies. And that's where I think some of the relevance for the wine world comes in. Now, there were studies, and Anne, correct me on this if I'm misremembering any of these, but there have been studies that have looked at things like the microbiome on the grapes or on the plants or around the roots of plants, under differing farming practices that have found systematic differences, say, between biodynamic wines, organic wines, and conventional wines. What that translates into in terms of flavor and consumer experience in wines, I think we're willing to do an experimental project if somebody would like to fund it, so we could go around the world drinking wine. But we didn't find that study.
Please use me as your, PA or whatever.
Yeah.
I'll take notes. I'll be
Um,
whatever.
but there are studies that have looked at things like how farming practices can affect the amount of resveratrol in crops, and how those kinds of compounds then turn around and influence human health. So there's interesting connections, but it's sort of an open world. And in the wine world, in terms of tillage, plowing, one of the big sort of impacts that we wrote about in Dirt, and that definitely disturbs soil life a lot, as you might imagine it would. What is the importance of that for the rows between vines? Because obviously, no vintner in the right mind, or no vineyard owner in the right mind, is going to plow their vines under every year.
Right.
But how they treat the land in between their vines, it's a similar thing for orchards and orchard crops. And
Yeah.
soil health really has been shown to matter for the health of plants in those environments, and to affect the microbial communities that are in contact with those plants. And the connections are very, very intriguing at this point. And the it seems hard to avoid the argument that healthy soils are going to affect the health of crops, and then what's actually in those crops. How desirable those things are and what they mean for things like wine, I think, is an area that could use more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Oh, for sure.
I th-
Yep.
yeah, and I think,
Sign us up.
there's so much complexity, in a vineyard or on a farm or inside the gut of an animal. And sometimes, um, we want to nail down the causal mechanisms. We want to find the one thing that will explain the everything. And I think, sort of these days with modern science and diagnostic techniques and technology and everything, we're getting this ever more detailed view of small things, which is good, because then that helps you understand how all of these individual components add up to explain a big picture. But sometimes we stay in these side alleys and these rabbit holes too long. And I think this happens. It's easy, when you're dealing with thousands of microbial species and thousands of microbial metabolites, to get stuck down in the details. But what I think at the same time, because there's value to that, but at the same time, I think we need to come back out of these holes and back out of these details and ask ourselves a really fundamental question. Okay, so based on what we know about ecology, based on what we know about how plants communicate with soil microbes, how humans communicate with their own microbiome, what do we know about what makes those processes functional, robust, self regulating, self regenerating? And that when you think about things on a process level, you're really asking the question, we just want this to work. We want to work. We want these things to work. We don't want to be inadvertently jamming monkey wrenches into biology, every time we farm or we eat, or any number of things. So I sort of think about the wine world in that whole context like this. And I think wine people really get this, say, in the way that maybe, tomato people, tomato growers or lettuce growers or zucchini growers don't get. And that is that the the way that the vine grows and the phytochemical profile of these different grapes occurs is through growing conditions. And wine people really get how that transfers through to flavor. I mean, right? That's like a huge thing
Yeah.
in the wine world. And so, if we know that these phytochemical profiles, phenolics in particular, come about because of the way the vine is communicating and growing, you want that process to not be messed up. And so I really like, in talking with wine people and being at a couple of conferences, I really like this notion that, the wine is made out there in the field. The winemaker
Yeah.
is just sort of the conductor of it all, bringing the right things together at the right time. And so I really like that whole concept because it's putting sort of the cred in the biology. And if we know how those biological processes work, you end up with wine, that has credibility too.
And it puts sort of a different spin on the whole concept of terroir, where if we think about terroir, not so much as directly the effects of, say, the soil or the climate on what's produced in the wine, but if you think about it as mediated through all those microbial connections, a lot of
Right.
it is happening in terms of the biology, and that means that the farmer, the grower, is actually as critical an element in terms of terroir as the sun and the rocks and the soil,
Mm-hmm.
through the way they actually treat their land, because that's going to affect the biology that's in the land, the microbial ecology that the plants are in communication with. And if terroir is microbially based, as has been argued in a number of well-placed research papers, then it puts a whole different sort of thing. It's not just the land and the climate; it's the whole systems, and it puts the farmer
Yeah.
sort of on an equal page with nature in terms of how the land is being treated as being important for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always say, I've stopped looking at a vineyard as the rows of vines. It's everything in
Mm-hmm.
around it, the whole ecosystem, including the human culture in which it's growing.
Mhm.
Because we are, I mean, the farmer gets to make choices, but the culture, the choices that the farmer gets to make are often determined by the culture in which that farmer lives as well, and what they've been exposed to in terms of knowledge and practice, and that becomes part of the terroir as well, because they're part of that. They're
Yeah.
part of that vineyard. The culture is part of the vineyard.
And
Yeah.
that's so true of just farming in general too around the world.
Yeah, that's very good point. Yeah, really well said, guys. I love that. So how do we not screw it up, as you were saying, Anne? What are the things that we can? How do we keep these processes, self-regenerating and healthy and vital and
Yeah.
vibrant?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that takes, a change of, now that I say this, I don't know what thing precedes what, is it the change of heart that leads to a change of mind, or is it a change of mind that leads to a change in heart? But whatever way that works, and maybe it's both,
Right.
it will eventually translate into new behaviors and new practices,
Mm,
whatever the motivational source is. And so I think that once anybody who's engaged in whatever form of agriculture, as soon as they start, I think, to see some of these connections, and farmers, and I imagine that vineyard folks are the same way, they're they're not really going to do anything unless they see some evidence that, oh, you mean all that stuff that you're talking about with soil health, like that's how you got this tomato, like really, that's all you did. So as soon as we see, I think, more examples out on the ground of new practices, I think it can light up the eyes um, of a farmer or anybody engaged in agriculture. Because I have to say, by and large, farmers are some of the smartest, most innovative people I have met. Right? They're constantly fixing. And I know this
yeah.
just from my gardening experience. You're constantly solving problems and trying to fix things, whether it's, a
Yeah.
piece of equipment that busted on you because it's a piece of crap. So you got to kludge it and MacGyver it to get it to work. Or, you've put some, in my case, it's like, oh man, that mulch is way too dry and it's not doing what I want. Now I need to go get some sopping wet stuff and, get the moisture right. So I think when you're constantly sort of trying to move to this, what in biology we call homeostasis, and so that is trying to get to a place of stability in a really dynamic environment, that when you can sort of see your farm or your vineyard in those ways, I think you become smarter, you become more of a tinkerer, because, let's face it, you're trying to grow a plant or raise an animal. Conditions are never the same, rarely the same from week to week, certainly not season to season. And so you're constantly like hopping, like, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now? And so if you
Hmm.
can, I think, apply that mindset with the overall goal of getting to better soil health, you sort of shift some of that burden. I mean, I'd much rather let my soil do the kludging and MacGyvering on on
Right.
you know getting me a healthy plant than me, the dumb human, sitting out here going, I don't know what you want. Can you tell me, dear plant? And of course, that's never going to happen. But I think I put a lot of credence in in biology and what plants and animals already know how to do. And in part, that's what the chapter on body wisdom in what your food aid is you know attempting to get at. It's just that if we don't recognize that it's happening and we don't support it, it's hard not to intervene with agrochemicals or tillage or any number of things that get applied to crops, animal bodies, and the soil.
What now? I know that there are some pretty like the five basic principles that you've sort of seen globally, or maybe there are just three principles globally. I think that you identified in Growing a Revolution. Can you talk about those? Like, so what are the basics? Like, if we go back and, I mean, just start there.
Yeah, so when in writing Growing Our Evolution, we sort of took off, armed with Anne's experience in the garden, and then visited farmers on small subsistence farms in West Central Africa, large industrialized ranches and farms across the U.S. So a whole range of settings, and tried to look at the practices that regenerative farmers who had been very successful at rebuilding the health and fertility of their land had employed. Then when you stand back and go, well, what are the common elements across this playing field? It really boiled down to three that are essentially going to no-till, minimizing disturbance of the soil. So stop plowing, stop digging up all the worms and slicing up the mycorrhizal fungal networks. So less disturbance of the soil, minimizing that. Keeping the land, that's sort of principle one. And that also helps cut down soil erosion. And if you're going to sustain the soil, you got to keep it on the land. So cutting down erosion is the down payment on building healthy soil. And then the second principle was to keep the land covered in living plants, to grow cover crops in between cash crops. Always keep living roots in the soil, because that helps plants produce what are known as exudates, that compounds they drip into the soil out of their roots to feed their microbial partners. That they recruit with those exudates. And then the third principle is to grow diversity of crops. Don't just always grow the same thing all the time in the same field. And why do those things work? Because the first one, in terms of minimizing disturbance, that's essentially providing habitat that's undisturbed that organisms would need. The second one, in terms of cover crops, well, that helps build organic matter. That's food. So you're housing and feeding soil life. And then a diversity of life recruits a diversity of life forms in the soil. And that's what you can get to build sort of a robust community of life for crops to partner with. So stop disturbing them, feed them, give them partners to play with. That's a recipe for cultivating beneficial life in the soil. And there's a fourth element that some of the farmers I visited for that book were employing, and that was reintegrating animal husbandry into their cropping operations, letting
Yeah, I was going to
cows, for
say.
example, graze off the stubble from their crops and manure their fields. And we came to view that as not a necessary requirement for regenerative practices, but a potential accelerant if it's done properly.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I'm of course thinking all of these and applying them directly to wine and vineyards. And if you are planting cover crops and not tilling, then you need some way to control
Right.
this, the growth.
Yep.
And it seems like if you can integrate animals to graze that growth, you have two solutions in one,
Yeah.
because you have fertility as well as controlling the cover crop growth.
Yep.
And uh, Now, in terms of diversity in perennial systems, do you see? Have you guys explored, or do you have any thoughts about sort of interesting things that grape farmers might do in terms of interplanting their rows with interesting things other than just sort of grasses and legumes and
Right.
things like that?
Yeah, I think we talk a little bit about this in the chapter about a farmer from South Dakota whose name is Jonathan Lundgren. And Jonathan is an entomologist. And what was so impressive about his farm, surrounded by cornfields, was the emphasis that he placed on providing places for pollinators to come and live and thrive. And were I a vineyard owner, and certainly if I had the kind of vineyard where I'm bringing people into the vineyard to look at the grapes and taste the wine and stuff, I think I think where we can combine biology and functional biology with beauty and aesthetics, that we have something really special. And so I would look at flowering plants and thinking about
Mm,
um, which pollinators, native pollinators, and or your regular honeybee, what
yeah.
when it comes to native pollinators, boning up on who are they, what are their preferred food sources, and where can I get those kind of plants and bring them into my vineyard? Because that just increases sort of the whole totality of what it is we're after, what I'm after anyway. And in an agricultural setting, which is I want this to be as dovetailed with ecology and biology and function and performance. So like I said,
Mm,
where you can get beauty that's functional, I mean, I'm all about that.
yeah.
That would be really cool. So that's I would think about flowering plants and taking better care of pollinators.
As that sounds like a great, and like you said, and beautiful solution.
Yeah.
um yeah, I love that. My mind was just wondering, thinking about those things, but are there other sort of mental shifts that you've encountered that you think are some of the more important ones, where the majority of the people you encounter pretty much just have a skewed idea of what they should be doing? Like, what are the big challenges that you're seeing in terms of getting people's minds
Yeah.
to shift on some of these ideas?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing quickly, and that is that um, I'm as horrified as a farmer or a grape grower when I spot the aphid or this pest or that pest, and you're really tempted to do it in, squash it, get it out of here. And I think one of the things that we learned from one of the no-till vegetable farmers that we feature in the book, this is a guy named Brian O'Hara out in Connecticut, is to, okay, before you want to kill something, think about uh, think about maybe instead of killing everything, how are you going to bring more living things into a system that might take care of this potential pest problem for you. So, a quick way to say that is, what if a farmer woke up every day thinking, instead of thinking, what am I going to go out there and kill today? What if they woke up and thought, what am I going to go outside today and get, onto my farm? Or what am I going to go out there and do to help, come alive in a way that's going to help me?
Yeah, like a probiotic versus an antibiotic
Kind
approach
of,
to
yeah.
to wine and agriculture. Yeah, I really like that. I mean, I think that is in the winemaking as well. Like that's sort of the approach I take. I feel like that might boil down the difference between what I think is the natural wine approach versus the conventional wine approach, which is like conventional wine is this sort of recipe where you sort of sterilize the juice and then have a inoculation of the specific thing that you want, versus natural wine where it's a probiotic approach where you're sort of encouraging the fostering of these microbes to be robust and healthy and take off and have a nice fermentation, so that you can just manage CO2 and not worry about using a lot of sulfur. I definitely think about that approach a lot too. Now, what how I know that in this book that the most recent one, What Your Food Ate, you finally talk about glyphosate, and I'd heard you say that you held off doing that because there were some studies that you weren't quite sure were conclusive, but you finally started talking about it. I was just at Lowe's, and it's there for sale, $13.99 a gallon for anybody who wants to buy as much as they want. And I'm wondering if you think it should be in our local hardware store like that, and what if you want to talk about what you found out and why you finally wrote about it.
Well, one of the odd things we found out about glyphosate was that in some sampling, I think it was the USGS, if I'm remembering it right, did of streams and rivers around the country, there was as much glyphosate in urban runoff as there was in agricultural runoff. We're using it pretty much everywhere: golf courses, yards, farms. It's the
Yeah.
most popular and profitable herbicide in the world.
Mm.
Whether it's wise for us to use as much of it as we do, I think, to me at least, the answer is clearly no. um, and in part, because there's other ways to farm and to garden and to manage golf courses that we could use that wouldn't need all that glyphosate. And
Yeah.
we wrote more about it in the new book, in part because there's been more studies that have come out, but also we were trying to look at the connections. We broke What Your Food Ate into these 4 sections, where we look at how farming practices affect the health of the soil, how the health of the soil affects the health of crops, how what's in our crops and soil affects the health of livestock, and then what all that means for human health. And when you start looking at all those connections, you sort of run into glyphosate in most of those linkages.
Right.
And there's been a lot of concern about it in terms of its health effects on people, but frankly, there haven't been that many studies that have been conclusive. But there's a lot more studies that look at its effects on soil life and how it can scramble a soil microbiome. Not by sterilizing the soil, but by changing the community composition, sort of who's there and what they're doing. And it turns out that there's some pretty clear evidence that it appears to undermine the health of crops by promoting the viability and success of pathogenic organisms. Certain kinds of fungi, for example, that can cause root rot in crops. There's other studies that have looked at what it will do to the microbiome of livestock, and thereby to the health of livestock. Most of those studies have come out of Europe. There hasn't been as much of a look at that in the U.S. But in terms of what it's doing to the health of the soil, looks like it's changing the community compositions, changing the kinds of relationships that we were writing about, and that help to provision crops with mineral micronutrients and spur their health. So yeah, we
Right.
finally sort of dug more into that for this book to try and look at what are those different linkages. And one of the things that I came away with in looking at that in terms of thinking about glyphosate was to maybe I'm not quite as concerned as the potential for direct human toxicity, which is how we tend to measure its effects in people. And and that then industry will argue that, well, it's not very directly toxic to people, so what's the problem? Well, it's the indirect effects that I became more concerned about after digging into the research on it. And that's things like, well, what would it do to the soil microbiome, to our own microbiome? There's the two original patents on glyphosate were for it as a mineral chelator, which is a scientific term for something that binds up mineral elements so that they can't be cycled through biological systems, and that could help reduce mineral uptake by crops, and therefore
Mm.
what's in food. But the second patent, and what to me is perhaps the more concerning one, is that glyphosate's a pretty good antibiotic. And that's a recipe for if it's in our food, if it's in our fields, what is it doing to all these microbial communities that we've now learned are so important to the health of the partner organisms, the plants out in the farm field, or our bodies for the communities in our own gut. Um, and the potential for those kinds of indirect effects to affect the health of our crops, or the health of ourselves or our livestock, are something that I feel needs a lot more sort of attention, because that's not really where the arguments around glyphosate have been tended to be focused or discussed. And that's not to downplay the issues around all the cancer cases that are going forward and so forth, but it is to say that there's this other dimension to that I think adds further evidence to the thought that maybe we should not be using so much of it. And that's one of the things I was really optimistic about in Growing a Revolution, was all the techniques that we went through that regenerative farmers use that allow them to do no-till farming without the use of glyphosate.
Right.
There's
That's
alternatives.
yeah. Yeah, I love that. Has what you've learned in writing these books changed and impacted your buying habits, especially when it comes to wine? And if so, how?
Yeah, what's really interesting about the wine world, I think that so many consumers are completely unaware of is, um, well, yeah, we'll just grab a bottle of wine. We'll be over, to your place, 7 o'clock for dinner, and we place all this emphasis on reading nutrition labels and watchdogging glyphosate levels in our food supply, and few people realize how much stuff and junk and bad things are added to wine. And to me, that's really, we first learned about this, I don't know, it was a while back, at all places, at a urban soils conference, listening to one of the speakers there. And so we've got this illusion, most of consumers, I think, have this illusion that wine is this kind of natural thing. I mean, they just fermented the grapes, right? And they put it in the bottle, and isn't this taste good? And and so I think somehow the wine world has to come to grips with the fact that, not in all cases is it a natural product, and it's some wines are stuffed with as much stuff as, an ultra processed food product, and
Yeah.
that stuff's just not good for us. It manipulates our body wisdom. We probably don't even understand uh, everything that it's doing to us, especially if it's not disclosed about, what is in all this wine. So for sure, it's changed our wine buying habits. And I know, just like in the food world, there's different certifications and different labels and so on. But I like that, when I see that a wine is organic, or it's Demeter certified, or it's a natural wine, or if I know, who made this wine, um, that's where we'll tend to look to buy things.
Yeah. Um, that's interesting. Me too. um, uh, well, and what's interesting is, I mean, this actually is kind of a good segue into what I want to be our final topic. But you guys live in Washington, and it is the second largest producer of wine in America, in the U.S., and yet you are I'm pretty sure, unless I'm forgetting somebody, the first Washingtonians I've interviewed in over 80 episodes. And that is specifically because Washington is pretty bad when it comes to, organic or better farming. And that's definitely changing. But, the state of Washington wine is not pretty in terms of the regenerative viticultural approach, or removing pesticides and things like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know if you guys get to work with Washington Vineyards in what you're doing, consulting or in any other way, but I'm just curious what you see as the state of that is. And then I guess the bigger question is, right across the border in Oregon, you have one of the best states I think the best state in the U.S. in terms of the percentage of people who are doing organic or better farming. Um, and and to me, that just kind of shows that there is this cultural element to what's happening. Um, can you Does that lead us to more hope or more despair in terms of affecting change at a larger level? And how do we do that?
Right.
There you go. Some
Well,
big questions for you.
it leads us to drink more Oregon wine, even though we
Yeah,
live in Washington,
exactly.
which is,
Right,
you
right.
know, I'm all for sourcing locally when one can, but I'd rather source better when need be.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of one of the real challenges in trying to shift the whole sort of global farming enterprise to a more sustainable and regenerative basis is that the socio-political dynamic ends of it, and there's habits of growers, there's the cultural part, there's incentives. I don't know what the sort of state regulations may be different in the two states, um,
Hmm.
but it's a really good question. But one of the reasons I'm a geologist is that rocks are pretty easy to deal with. You get people involved and it gets complicated.
Well, I think, that's an interesting observation, Adam, that you made, because not a lot of people, I mean, certainly Washingtonians and Oregonians, would be onto this, but most people lump Washington and Oregon together and say,
Yeah.
oh, that's the Pacific Northwest, whatever, volcanoes, this, that, and the other.
Right.
It's all the same out there. But in fact, it's not. And I think maybe part of the explanation for why Washington is so different from Oregon is that um, the east, both Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon are hot, dry places,
Hmm.
and agriculture has, as soon as I think it was back in the Roosevelt era that we began to irrigate Eastern Washington with the dams on the Columbia and so on, and so that was the springboard for agriculture to take off in Washington State because it's a desert over there. And
Yeah.
as soon as you pour water on the land, wow, you know, wow, cherries, look at how they grow. I think Washington
Yeah.
State is the world's biggest exporter of cherries or something like that. And oh, look at all the fruit crops. And then, wine grapes came along later. And what they maybe imprinted on was the ag practices at the time for these other perennial crops, the orchard crops, the stone fruit, cherry, and so on. And Washington and Oregon, to some extent has that same legacy, but in many ways, Oregon has always been, kind of a greener state, if you will,
Mm.
than Washington on some fronts. Um, so that maybe what's happening with Washington, vineyard folks is they're still maybe a little bit on, the agricultural legacy of Washington State. And we also lack, as does Oregon, we really are not sitting here in a Mediterranean climate. so
Yeah.
so whereas California is, and that's a big part of the wine world, and so we've got some constraints here, and maybe we're not dealing with them as creatively or as biologically as we might. But I would sure like to see things change in Washington.
I think Anne almost got to what as I've been sitting here sort of thinking about it, listening to it, because I've never thought about this before, that there might be a fairly simple answer rooted in the cultural connection that you were mentioning, Adam, and that is that most of the wine growing in Washington State happens on the east side of the Cascades. Much
Hmm.
of the wine growing in Oregon happens in the Willamette Valley on the west side of the Cascades.
Hmm.
And there's a very big cultural difference between the two sides of the mountains in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't think it's that surprising upon reflection that the folks who are growing wine on the western side of the mountains might have a higher proportion of people who would be inclined to get into and experiment with and adopt a more organic, biodynamic, or natural wine growing practices, just from the cultural makeup of the populations on the two sides of the mountains.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. And I also, anytime you have agriculture butting up against urban populations and there's issues of toxicity, whether direct or indirect, urban populations are like, not really, liking the spraying of whatever over our homes. And maybe that is what forced Oregon growers to look at different practices. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, it's well, and it brings up the. I mean, I know a lot of this is speculative, just in comparing those two
Yeah,
states,
yeah.
but yeah, I'm sure you have identified some of the real causes there. I'm curious if it. I mean, does that? How does that translate? Or maybe the better question is, in your travels and in dealing with I'm sure a variety of people, different farmers and different with different perspectives on life and politics and everything else. Do you find that there is that I mean, are we at an impasse because of the politics of our nation right now, and is that going to hold back implementing some of these solutions?
Well, you're right. We are at an impasse in society, on a lot of levels. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's consuming way too much of our creativity and our time and our energy. And I start to think about this concept in biology that I talked about earlier, homeostasis. And it's like, how do you remain stable despite all the dynamics that come at you? So I think
Hmm.
I think society is kind of out of homeostasis. I think we used to be able to live together despite our disagreements about things, whether that's, how to grow a grape or corn or tomatoes or whatever, onto many other topics. I don't think it's good for us. I don't think it's good for society. And I I would really like to, see things that start reversing that in just about, every every place that I see it.
Yeah, I actually think that one of the things I took away from my travels around the world visiting regenerative farmers was the broad spectrum of political philosophies that they embrace. It's not a monolithic movement. Some of the most conservative friends that I have these days are some of these regenerative farmers from the Midwest who, politically we probably don't agree on much, but I love what they're doing to their land. And I think
Hmm.
that one of the things that has turned me into an optimist on the issue of the future of agriculture is that I've yet to meet a farmer who was really intentionally destroying their land or intentionally degrading the fertility of the land. They all care about the land and they're aware of it.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of room for common ground in terms of looking at practices that can rebuild the fertility of the land if they work out economically for farmers. And that's where I've started to become an optimist because, with the rising price of fertilizers, the rising price of patented seeds, the prices of agrochemicals, the depressed prices for commodity crops, farmers are so squeezed at the moment that, if you can basically go to them and say, hey, there's this different way of farming that could slash your nitrogen bill, slash your diesel bill, slash your pesticide bill. Um, the first response is usually, well, tell me more, because they're interested in that. And I think that the adoption of more regenerative practices can be a real engine for revitalizing the profitability of farms around the world. And there's a lot of side benefits that come with using fewer pesticides and less nitrogen in terms of the environment and pollution. there's a lot of positive elements. And so I think there's room, if we think about the land differently, it may help us, at least on a few issues, to overcome some of the political divisions that we have in terms of moving this stuff forward. Now, that may be hopelessly optimistic and naive, but I'll grasp onto that little bit of optimism for as long as I can legitimately defend it.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Well,
when you take, right, you get two farmers together and there's automatic common ground just by virtue of the fact that they're farmers. They've got experience trying to keep things alive and grow things. And I think if you set aside the political views or the other differences and you put them in a room together and say, we're just going to talk about, what has worked for you when you grow, X, Y, or Z, and what hasn't worked. And let's, kind of workshop out what from our collective experience does it look like would be,
mm,
promising practices to get our soils, back up on their feet, higher function and healthier crops, which, as we argue in What Your Food Ate, the minute you have healthier crops and healthier animals, there's a ripple effect out to the nutritional quality, because that's always been, the great promise of agriculture is not only to feed us, but the food that does land on our plates, it should be real sustenance. It should be chock full of all of the things that our bodies need to remain healthy.
hmm would you say, I mean, it sounds like what both of you are saying in different ways is maybe trying to focus on political change might be wasted effort, but it's just letting the systems that work speak for themselves, because they are so, they will provide economic benefit to farmers. They will do all these things that are motivating in themselves, and it's sort of from a ground up change that will happen. Essentially, is that do you agree with that?
Well, in a way, I actually think we need both. I think that sort of ground up, the bottom up drive and impetus for adopting regenerative practices is there. It's real and viable in farming communities. But I think we also need top down. We need political support for it. But
Okay.
how we go about framing that and casting it might be, different for different audiences. But if the common element are that policies, our agricultural subsidies, our agricultural policies ought to be aligned to reward farmers who are building healthy soil.
Yeah.
If we can't agree on that as a body politic across this country, then we ain't going to agree on nothing.
Well, and maybe as a closing shot, you said we need to think about soil differently. I know you stated that beautifully in the book. If you want to sort of summarize what you think that different perspective is, I love that.
Well, I don't remember how we actually wrote about it in the book, but we'll try. See, that's the power of writing stuff down. You don't have to remember
You're
it.
right. You don't have to remember it.
Yeah, but if we look at soil, if we look back the last 100 years, in effect, soil's been viewed as the cheapest industrial input to a very industrialized process of farming. We haven't valued the soil particularly in that equation. But if we look at it instead as essentially nature's engine for growing biomass and producing healthy crops, if we look at it as the foundation for good farming practices, if we look at soil health as the lens that we should evaluate farming practices through, it gives us a whole different perspective on the land that would lead to a different style of farming practices that would value soil life, that would cultivate beneficial life in the soil, and that we argue could produce comparable harvests of more nutritious food.
Yeah. And okay, so Adam, I'm going to go all naturey on you with my
Yeah,
with
please. Oh,
my
I love that.
input on this. So I'm, in everything I've researched and written and thought about when it comes to soil, it's sort of in my mind's eye, I see it as nature's greatest wallflower, right? There it is.
Mm.
We see it sitting on the sidelines, kind of dumpy, not looking so good. Who's going to dance with soil? I want to turn that around and I want to get soil out on the dance floor, swinging partners left and right, shining and vibrant. and being the hub of life that it really is. And so when we begin to think about soil as less of nature's wallflower and more, one of the shining lights of nature, I think we then can begin to treat it differently and see it differently. So that's where I want to kind of go with this whole notion of, getting people more excited, more passionate, and talking more about soil health.
That's great. Well, thank you guys so much for all this. There's so much more we could talk about, and I would love to, but I want to be respectful of your time. I highly recommend everybody check out your books. I will be, mentioning those. Do you have any closing shots or anything that you want to promote?
No, I mean, if people are interested in following up with us or contacting us, we have a website. It's dig2grow.com, dig the number 2 grow.com. And we also are intermittently active on Twitter with the handle @dig2grow, dig the number 2 grow. And we're happy to engage with people if they want to approach us. And we obviously encourage people to read all our books.
I do too. Well, thank you again so much. It was great, and I really appreciate you giving your time and sharing your knowledge to help us all and hopefully push us in the right direction. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And if you did, please do leave a review for the Organic Wine Podcast. It helps a lot, and we want to get the word out to as many people as we can, which your review will help do. Thanks so much.